Welcome to Bootstrapping Governance. My name's Fee.
And I'm Giselle, or G.
So we're both corporate lawyers at Mark Lawyers, and also co-hosts of a podcast called Subtitles On.
Hence why we have the microphone.
We're actually being super productive here and dueling our Spark presentation with an episode of Subtitles On. So if there is anything that you missed during the presentation that you kind of wanted to listen to again, definitely tune in and follow us. The podcast is available on all the places you listen to it, Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. All right, so jumping straight into it, what are we talking about today? We are talking about governance.
World's most boring topic.
Yeah, we recognize the fact that, governance is really kind of a boring or topic, or often is at the last of your list when you're a startup. We get it. You have to work out who you're going to hire. You have to work out if you're going to be able to pay for them, what your offering is. Can you launch the app? How do you launch the app? And governance is probably not at the top of your list. However, we're going to today firstly talk about what governance actually is, and then we're going to run through why it's difficult to kind of prioritize it, and then give you some tips and tricks on how to implement governance either straight from the start or how to tidy it up. We're also going to touch a little bit on how purpose in companies can be imbued through your governance structures, and then open it up for some questions. Do feel free to ask questions kind of as you go along. We'll probably address it more at the end though, but fire away if you have anything to address. I think probably one of the things that I guess I just want to bridge a gap for you guys. I get it. We're coming at you from lawyers, and I know you're probably, as lawyers, you're probably thinking it's easy to sit in that position and kind of say, yes, put corporate governance at the front of your list, but as a startup, that's not probably the easiest thing to do. I will let you know that Subtitles On is kind of the way that we have our own little startup, so we get the same kind of issues that you go through in terms of prioritizing this stuff, so we're very much sympathetic to how it all works.
And we don't have a corporate governance structure.
Exactly. We need to take our own advice is where we're coming from. Let me just flick over to our first slide. All right, so what is corporate governance? Look, we've put on here a definition from the Governance Institute of Australia, and I think it does kind of capture what governance is quite well. So it says, governance is something that encompasses the systems by which an organization is controlled and operates, and the mechanisms by which it and its people are held to account. It's ethics, risk, management, compliance, and administration that are all elements of governance. Now, I get it. Those are actually just words on a screen. I will unpack that for you more. And might I flag here, one of the or the main purpose of our podcast is actually to unpack the language that is feeling kind of the corporate world and makes it quite exclusive. So that's not what we're going to do here today. We're going to try and really lay it down for you guys in simple terms. The way that I like to think about corporate governance is kind of like a system of checks and balances. Mm-hmm. Really the main thing that I would kind of hone in on is thinking about how decisions are made. So looking at, who makes those decisions? How are those decisions made, and what informs those decisions? So what elements are you actually bringing into to come to a final call?
Yeah, and when you talk about who makes those decisions, I think one of the most important things for anyone that's starting a company is to understand that there's a bunch of different decision makers in the company. So you've got your board, you've got your shareholders, and then you might, in between the two, you might have management who are then making decisions. And so whenever you're making decisions, you kind of need to ask yourself, am I making this decision as the director, and therefore I put my director's hat on, I have to do it in a certain way because I've got duties to the company, or am I making this decision as a shareholder, and therefore can I act in my best interests? So I think that's one of the key things to think about as well. Are you just turning slides on?
Yeah, I've just had a look and it says, where are your slides? Great question. I'm not sure. I've turned on
everything.
Things and Okay, maybe we don't have slides.
All right, we're going to proceed without slides.
We're just going to keep going with it then.
We can describe what they look like.
Exactly.
This is a yellow slide.
It's a yellow slide that says, okay, so why does corporate governance matter? And I actually think this is probably a really important part of the whole kind of ambit of corporate governance because...
Hold on.
We've got them. Brilliant.
Can we, before we... Sorry, I think maybe the slides just threw us slightly. Okay. I think, yep, do you want to go to the next slide? Cool. Oh no, go back to the other slide. What I was going to say is just to talk about what the corporate governance structure is in Australia and kind of the things that basically inform corporate governance. And so in this presentation, we're just kind of focusing obviously on startups, so which are typically a private company, and therefore the corporate governance kind of structures of the ASX listing rules and like best practice guidelines don't really apply, and we're not going to be touching on them. But the things that really do apply are going to be the Corporations Act, which we'll talk about. It has certain things that it says, you know, a director has to make these decisions, or actually it really doesn't, but it kind of, it says that there's certain decisions that shareholders have to make, and then otherwise directors make the rest of the decisions. And then obviously some companies have constitutions. It's not mandatory, but often you will have a constitution. That's another place that informs decision making and the corporate governance and how the company needs to be run. And the third thing is a shareholders agreement, which, you know, look, we as lawyers will very much encourage you to put one in place, but that's, you know, again, it's not mandatory, but it is something that as you grow and if you bring on third-party investors, they'll typically want to see one put in place. And in that, you'll again have kind of, I guess, the broad outline of a corporate governance framework, because you're starting to say, well, these are the key people in the company, and these are the people that we want to make or have a say on certain decisions.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, so getting through to why does it matter? I often like to think of it in the kind of values paradigm, and looking at it as going, well, corporate governance itself actually adds a lot of value in the terms of actually adding zeros to your valuation of your company when investors are looking at the company coming in from a kind of, you know, investment or capital raising perspective. They're going to be looking at, okay, how actually have your decisions been made in the past? What kind of framework do you have in place in order to make decisions, and what kind of records do you have showing how these decisions are actually made? That's adding value to your company when you can display to an investor exactly what's been happening in the corporate history.
Yeah.
The other side of it is, again, the values, but when we're talking about it more in the aspect of saying that corporate governance is and should be often underpinned by the company's purpose and values in which it operates. So any decision that you're making should actually be within a framework of why it is that you're around and that you exist as a company. And that in itself should inform and, you know, shine some light on your decision-making structures. The other two, what we're really talking about is accountability. So if it is that you do make a decision to, you know, kind of do some kind of corporate action, you're going to write that decision down, and then you're going to probably do it. So it's kind of that process of keeping yourself and the company and the players within the company accountable.
Yeah.
It also obviously just creates structure and professionalism in the way in which you operate as a business. And again, what that really does is add value to an investor.
Yeah, and I would add a few more kind of things. I mean, I think that in the last few years, we've obviously seen a focus on, I think, some corporate governance scandals. There's obviously been some close to home with like the Banking Royal Commission, CBA, there was the APRA report into CBA. Then, you know, like these are obviously listed companies and of course are held to a higher standard. But similarly overseas, you've got lots of these kind of unicorn, private, big behemoth startups, you know, the likes of Uber, WeWork, Theranos, and they all have, for differing reasons, had corporate governance scandals. And I think as a result of that, there's a lot more emphasis that we're certainly seeing, even even at seed funding kind of stages of investors being really invested in understanding, okay, well, what mechanisms do you have in place to ensure that you keep the founder and the CEO accountable? The other thing I would say is that I think if we take a step back and look at corporate governance from kind of a economic and a social point of view, it has really wide implications. Good corporate governance effectively allows, investor confidence and therefore, leads to economic growth. And so I think there's that part to think about. And I also think that there's a lot of emphasis, obviously, at the moment about sustainability. And I think that sustainability is not just about making money over time, but it's also about being transparent, and it's about ensuring that you can govern yourself and yet be transparent with all your stakeholders.
Yeah, the transparency. If you've got good structures in place, you're
Yep.
basically showing to an investor, hey, here's how we kind of on a platter. Here's how we
Exactly.
make our decisions, and that is absolutely so important. All right, so moving on, we've kind of just explained the value proposition for why corporate governance is so important, but wait a second, why don't startups do it? We get it. As I said, with us in Subtitles On, we use this first excuse all the time, and that being we don't have the time to put it in place. It seems corporate governance generally seems like a little bit of an overarching mammoth beast that is hard to actually achieve. It kind of comes across as like this inane kind of concept that you're going, oh God, I don't even know where to start. Hopefully, and this goes into the know-how point that we've made here, is that hopefully, with this presentation, we'll kind of make it a little bit clearer that there are some small things that you can do that feed into, that don't take up that much time or money. But one of the other challenges, as I've just flagged, is actually the know-how. So often founders will go, God, I don't even know what corporate governance is or how to implement it. And what I'd have to do is kind of get a lawyer and get them to put in place all of these structures and frameworks for me, and that costs too much, and I just don't have the resources. As I said, we get it, but there certainly are small things that you can be doing from a startup stage that can really help assist in creating a framework early on.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is that it's just like, I think the crux of it, it's not actually required necessarily. It's the same as you don't have to have a constitution, you don't have to have a shareholders agreement, you don't have to have a corporate governance framework. You probably do have one without actually realizing that you have one. But I think that that's kind of one of the things. And then obviously it's everything else you've said, time, resources, money. It all seems too much, too hard.
Exactly.
And so you only do it when you have to.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to show you why you can do it, and it's probably not as, all-encompassing or overwhelming as you may think it can be. All right, so let's imagine you're starting from fresh. You just started your company, and you want to implement corporate governance at the very beginning. There are, in our minds, three main areas in which you can implement corporate governance. One is you're in your decision-making. And that really, what we're kind of honing in or harking on about here is actually turning your mind to and having a focus on who makes the decision. And that being, as Giselle already pointed out, is it a decision made at a board level, or is it a decision made at a shareholder level, or is it a decision that the CEO can make? And we totally appreciate, as a founder, you are all three of those people. But that's not to say that you can't put on your director hat and make a decision versus putting on your CEO hat or your shareholder hat and make a different decision in different contexts. Now, if you're looking for a place that sets out who makes those decisions when, often your constitution will have it in there, but as Giselle pointed out, we also usually see it in a shareholders agreement. Doesn't mean you have to have one in place, but rather at the beginning, it is really the process of turning your mind to who's appropriate to be making that decision.
Yep.
The second one is record keeping. This is like a really big one that I think is good to good to think about in terms of when you're getting investors coming on, what is it that they want to see? It can be as simple as, from the beginning, you have a meeting with your co-founder, and after the meeting, you write in an email, hey, that meeting was great, this is what we chatted about, and you save that into a folder called meeting minutes. Those are your minutes. Yep. Now, as you progress on, sure, you might end up getting like some really beautiful templates that have proper minutes that put everything in there. But from the start, I'd suggest that you just get stuff written down, recorded, and stored somewhere so that you can look back on it and reflect on it. And that's the third point of corporate governance that you can implement right from the beginning. It's monitoring and maintaining from the beginning. What I mean by that is it's actually looking back on your week. And I think actually often founders do this anyway from a commercial kind of perspective. You kind of have a bit of a weekly wrap-up. You know, at the end of the week, you sit back and go, God, okay, what did we actually do here? What decisions, but what I want to, I guess, push is that there is definitely a conversation to be had at the end of the week to reflect back on, okay, what decisions did we make? How did we make them? And did we tick off everything that we wanted to in all of those decisions? That's that reflection process, that maintenance process.
And yeah, I think the thing I also wanted to talk about on this slide was that as a founder, I think what you need to appreciate is that your corporate governance framework is really going to change as your company, depending on where you are in basically your life cycle. So if you can imagine, you've started your company, and if it is just you as a founder, there's very little reason to have a corporate governance framework because you're the sole director and sole shareholder. I mean, sure, you probably should start thinking about the differences between making those decisions, but really you're being accountable to yourself, and whether you are or aren't, that's up to you. But then obviously that kind of thinking then will shift if you bring on a co-founder, and so then how do Fee and I make our decisions about subtitles on? You know, how do we have to have unanimous board decisions or unanimous shareholder decisions or blah, blah, blah. Probably at 50-50, that's how it's going to run. But then suddenly we decide we want to branch out, we're going to get some merch for our subtitles on, and mum and dad, your mum, they want to contribute, they want to take some shares, of course. So then we've got this new group of shareholders who we have to report to, and so that's a different type of corporate governance framework that you start to think about. Who appoints directors? They probably don't because they're just little shareholders, you know, but they'll still get a say as a shareholder. So then how do we report to them, blah, blah, blah. It then changes again if we then have, you know, a VC come on who they say, love what you guys are doing, let's take this to the next level, but we want a preference type, you know, share in there. And so then you've suddenly got, you know, you've got two different shareholding types, and you might have a conflict there as to governance as between that. How do decisions get made between an ordinary shareholder and a preference shareholder? How does, you know, the VC then wants to have a role on your board? How do decisions there get made? Is it the founders are still driving it, or, you know, do the investors, are they now driving the company? And so you can kind of start to see how really depending on where you are in your life cycle will really start to inform the corporate governance framework.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is an evolving kind of system in which continuously needs, I guess, updated, refreshed, looked at, turned your mind to, considered. And it's really kind of actually that mindset, I guess, that we're talking about here.
And I think it's like, this is a bit off topic, but I think quite interesting in the sense that startups actually can end up with these quite complex structures due to having, you know, different classes of shares. I mean, we've seen, you know, like multiple, like up to 4 or 5 different classes of shares. And so then you can appreciate, okay, well, each time they try to do a raise, then if it's going to be a preference to those other ones, having to involve them and blah, 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 blah. And it becomes quite complex, and in some ways much more complex than a listed company. And that's why I think you start to see these big unicorns who have actually got these crazy structures that actually say, you know what, as much as we don't want to be listed, and in some ways it would be easier to remain private, because of what we've created here is this corporate governance structure of various, you know, share classes and, you know, board seats, blah, blah, blah. It is actually going to be easier to list and just have one share class.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of thinking about it if you're starting from fresh, but we get it. often you are starting from fresh. Really, you're often in a position where you're feeling like, okay, yes, you've been sole shareholder and director for the last year, and now it's, oh God, you're going out to market to get some investors. How do I tidy this up? How do I put in place a framework which makes sense now? The way I think that I kind of like to think about tidying your corporate governance is kind of like doing due diligence, on your decision making. So it's kind of going through the process of going, okay, how have I been making decisions over the last year? In the reality, every founder is doing it every day when they make their decisions. The extent of your corporate governance is how official you have made that process that you're doing in your head. How official have you made the thought that you go, okay, I'm making this decision here as a director. I'm going to consider my values and the purpose of our company against the revenue and finances and a profit in which enables me to actually fulfill this decision in which I've made. Weighing that up against, does this decision affect any further stakeholders, being my customers, and how did their interests come into play? You're already doing that as founders. So really, it's kind of sitting back, doing an assessment or an audit of what that process is that you're doing and what you have been doing. Then it's kind of thinking, okay, you want to assess, all right, well, as a priority, how is it kind of that, what's the main thing that I need to tackle here? Is it that I have no records of any of my decisions being made? Is it that I have no process in place? I've been making decisions willy-nilly for the last year with actually no thought whatsoever. What's kind of the priority? And then it's doing, a cleanup. Now, I've written on this slide here, folders. I actually think it is really important to get your record straight and clean and tidy. And I mean it in the way of saying, literally create folders that you think investors are going to want to see. So whether it's, corporate governance folder, subfolder, corporate IP, commercial contracts, what have you. And the process of going through how decisions are made in each of those items in every aspect of your business is that DD that I'm talking about, that you're kind of going through and cleaning up your corporate governance. And the last one is implementing it, corporate governance. And in terms of tidying it, there certainly are circumstances in which, you made a company decision, but actually you just didn't write it down. And the way in which you can remedy that is by going at your next, for example, if with subtitles on, Giselle and I decided we want to change the trademark colors or our logo colors, to pink. And we decided to make that decision last week. We didn't write it down. We have another board meeting this week. You certainly can, in those board meeting minutes, write, last week we changed the colors and we're ratifying that decision now. Essentially, you're recording it in these minutes. And again, you can also sort of start refreshing stuff. These T's and C's that we put on there online are completely out of date. Let's start refreshing them. Let's make a decision on that and let's record it and let's put into place. And that's when we're thinking of the decisions and recording it, going through that process of, okay, let's think about who should make the decision. Let's think about what informs this decision. And having that kind of exact process in place, set down somewhere, is exactly the kind of thing that you want to start doing early on.
Yeah. And I think the reality is that often this process is probably something that you're only going to think about when you've got a first serious investor that's either, sniffing around your company and is interested in investing. And I guess the thing that I would say is, don't let them inform what your structure should look like. I think it's worth, there's certainly things that they're going to say that are really important to them, but that doesn't necessarily make sense if you're focusing on what is the purpose and the values of your company and what things are important to you versus what things are important to them. And so I think don't be guided necessarily by them and just accept everything that the investor's saying. It is quite important for you to sit down and actually, think about the different decisions, who makes them, and what do you want to have a say over.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. So this is another area that we just wanted to touch on, because at the moment in 2020, the discussion around companies with profit and purpose is very much a topical discussion. It's very much important, and purpose can very, very much so be imbued and filtered through and underpin your corporate governance framework and structures, and we'd suggest should in fact inform your corporate governance structures.
Do you know, actually, sorry to interrupt your slide, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was a corporate governance podcast, because I was just getting psyched up.
Who would do a corporate governance podcast?
I know. Getting psyched up for today, and anyway, they were talking about the biggest moments in 2019 in corporate governance, but what they talked about was the Larry Fink letter, which was, I think, January last year, early on in 2019. So Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock. Anyway, he put out his annual letter to shareholders and basically said, this is just one part of it, but basically said society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of the stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. And what followed on from that was then, I think it was August or July, but the Business Roundtable, which is a big organisation of all the CEOs in America, and I think it's like 108 of them, but basically got together and flipped their kind of purpose of a company statement that they'd had in place for, I think, like almost 20 years or something. But they said that basically it was that companies had to benefit all stakeholders rather than just being shareholder focused. So I think like that, together with what came out with APRA and talking about purpose and culture. Anyway, I'll keep you talk, but that was just very exciting.
Absolutely, and the enshrining purpose into your corporate governance structures is actually a topic that resonates with us quite closely. At Mark, we're a certified B Corp, and that's essentially a certification that recognizes that we're a company that values both purpose with profit. And certainly at Subtitles On, we have a very clear purpose. The entire aim of our podcast is to break down the language of the corporate world that makes it incredibly complex and completely exclusive for people who don't know what that language means. And it is exactly that purpose that drives every decision in which we make for Subtitles On. And similar to at Mark, it drives the partners. Their purpose drives the partners' decisions for every decision that they make in the business. The way that you do often kind of enshrine purpose into your governance, there are a few ways. It is a matter of actually just setting out and sitting there and taking the time and going, what is our purpose as a business? What are we sought out to do? What are we here to actually do for our customers, our clients, community at large? What is our purpose? Whether you want to put that just as a purpose statement on your desk, or if you want to actually go even further, we are starting to see a lot of companies start putting their purpose into their constitution. This is actually a push that has been made through B Corp itself as a part of the certification process. The reason why it's almost goes a step further to put it in the constitution is because it's harder to change. You need shareholder approval at a higher threshold, whereas if you just kind of write it down and put it on your desk, the board can change it at any given time. That's not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing. Perhaps that is part of your purpose. But it is a matter of actually kind of defining it clearly at the start. And then the next kind of, step is going, okay, that purpose, that statement that we kind of live and breathe as a business, that needs to be considered in every decision we make. Yeah. Whether it's hiring someone to be a part-time contractor who's developing whatever, or if it is because you want to bring on a huge investor. when you're making that decision, you want to start thinking, actually, does this align with our purpose? And particularly with capital raising, I think we're starting to see kind of companies really consider who it is that they're accepting as investors. It's not just anyone throwing money at them anymore. It's actually, does this investor's business line with my business?
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's so the corporate governance, I guess, piece of that is that the board's job is to set the purpose, which then or define that purpose, which then will set the strategy, which filters down to the values of the organisation. And then from values, you get behaviour, and from behaviour, you then have a culture. Like a perfect example was with the CBA report. And so I think, CBA been doing all sorts of terrible things, including charging people when they didn't give them like fees for no service, variety of other things as well. But one of the big things that APRA really said was that they kind of had lost their way. You know what I mean? Like when they started out as a bank, was it like, we are going to charge our customers for things we don't give them, or like A&P, we're going to charge our dead customers. Like, it's just abhorrent. And whoever that there was because they'd lost their purpose, And so when you have people that are on the ground making decisions and they don't have that framework, it's impossible for them to realise, because what had been prioritised by the boards in those cases was money.
Yeah.
Financial performance, results, etc. Same with Uber. I think they had that investigation into the, sexual harassment claims, and what came back was, well, that guy was a really high performer. And it's like, well, that's not okay. But you're there, all you're seeing in that behaviour is an echo of what obviously the board is prioritising.
Yeah.
So
it is, exactly. So it is important then to, I guess, define that early on and set up a structure for which it actually informs every decision you're making, whether that is at a board level or a CEO level or, your employee level.
Yeah.
It informs how you operate as a business as a whole.
Yeah.
All right. So I think we kind of have covered how important corporate governance is, some tips and tricks as to kind of implementing it early, whether it's literally just storing emails that between you and your founder from as minutes, or if it's putting in place kind of a more structured framework as to how each decision is made, and then defining your purpose and letting that inform your decision making. And as we say, recording it, filing it, keeping it somewhere where you can display it to investors when you're trying to add value to your company. The big tips, as I've kind of set out on this slide, is write it down. If there's anything that I'd say take away from this, is write it down. Doesn't have to look pretty at the beginning, but just get it recorded somewhere. And the next one being, think about your investors. Think about them early. What would they want to see? If you're trying to pitch your company, you're going to want to say, well, we have been doing this for the last year. We have been thinking about these things, and I've got it stored here pretty so you can have a look at it when you're doing due diligence on our company. And then the last one is that reflect and revisit. Be accountable. As Giselle said, your governance framework and structures it evolves as you as a company evolves. And the only way that you can kind of feel that evolution is if you're being conscious of self-reflecting on what it is that you've done in the past and how that can inform what you're doing in the future.
Yeah.
And as I said, it just actually keeps you accountable in the sense of going, oh God, we've put in the last minutes that we were going to do this. I'm looking at it now and we still haven't done it. Okay, well, now I've got to really prioritize it without, I guess, having written and recorded those decisions in which you've decided to make. It makes it pretty tough to remember and keep yourself accountable, really.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of this is just really good habits, and it's about, I think, again, going back to the basics of understanding how a company makes decisions and the people involved. And I think just being really comfortable with that from the get-go. When you're not comfortable, then you know where you've got to go look. So is it in your constitution? Maybe it's your shareholders agreement. Maybe it's the Corps Act. So that will then help you inform. And then it is just making a habit of, okay, this is the person that needs to make a decision. Let's record that. and let's file it away somewhere and then just continue to maintain that. And then, as Fee said, as we evolve, that might change slightly. There might be new things you have to do. But it's not an overly complex idea, really.
And I guess, if anything, I'd say just kind of turn your mind to it. Put it in the forefront. Think about it. Oh, when I'm doing this action in the company, when I'm deciding to, put these T's and C's on the website, when I'm deciding to pitch someone on buying my product, how am I doing that? What process am I going through to make that call to pitch that particular person? To do any kind of corporate action, kind of just keeping in mind, how am I arriving at this decision? As I say, you're already doing it. It's just a matter of actually recording it and putting in that process to make sure that you do it every time you make every decision in the business. So the next slide is just about, we've just got questions here, and do feel free to flick through some questions on the portal now. I think you've got one here. I'll just quickly, we actually got a couple questions that I think came through a different presentation, but the organizers at Spark have flicked over to us because they kind of are wrapped up in our topic as well. So the first one that we got was around, okay, so how do those with kind of startup strategy, governance, DD experience, find organizations that need directors? To be honest, I think for us, we'd say it's more like really making yourself available to places like startup hubs, going to pitch nights. If you kind of have that experience and are well across the governance structures and how they operate, and then find a startup that inspires you and reach out to them. If you're at a pitch night and you go, God, I'm inspired by that company. Hey, I actually am quite versed in this area. I know, quite a lot about. Don't be afraid to reach out. But yeah, that's where you're going to find startups. Really, it's just a matter of where you're finding them. It's going to be your startup hubs.
Yeah.
The other one is, how can you build a governance board, and what should they be focusing on?
Yeah. So building a board, it's a hard one, really, because I think, look, the best practice is always going to be to have as many independent directors as you possibly can. But as a startup, that's obviously a little bit difficult because your resources are limited, and typically a true independent director would expect to be paid for their services. Really, what your board is probably going to be looking like for quite a while is going to be a combination of investors and the founders. It is interesting. I found some stats saying that, even, and I would say that this is probably my experience as well, is that, startups tend to bring on an independent director who I would say is not really actually an independent director, but solely not actually to help with the governance of the organisation necessarily, but as a tiebreaker. And so that person just literally becomes a person that, kind of conciliates or, any disputes as between the body of the founders and the investors. But look, I think that the best thing that you can do to build a good board is actually to build a good corporate governance framework.
Yeah.
Because I think the better your operations are and the way that you do things, I think that there'll obviously be a correlation with the people that you're attracting. You'll be attracting funding, and therefore you'll be able to attract good talent to be on your board.
Absolutely. If you have a particular independent director that you're looking to engage, and you go, look, this is actually how we make decisions already. Here's my structure and how I do that. That's going to attract the right person. They're going to go, okay, wow, you are already thinking about this stuff. And so, yeah, I couldn't agree more. The other one is how do you keep founders accountable? And I think we've sort of already touched on this throughout the whole presentation. if you've got those structures in place and your founders are kind of essentially bound by those structures in that they have to think about, okay, this is actually now a director and board decision versus a shareholder decision versus me as CEO. And as CEO, I can actually only make decisions up to a certain threshold because you have a governance structure in place that says you as a CEO can only make decisions up to that threshold. That's how you're keeping them in check. That's how you're keeping them in balance. It is very much about thinking about, okay, what does it make sense to give to the founder in their capacity as, say, CEO versus, maybe they're also sitting on the board and also a shareholder. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the things that we would see an investor want put into, say, a shareholders agreement, which really are to keep a founder accountable, are going to be information type rights. So you have a limited amount of rights to information under the Corporations Act. Constitution's generally silent on it. And so what an investor typically asks for in a shareholders agreement is a list of things that they can have access to, either on an annual basis or a quarterly basis. I mean, normally at the very bottom would be, they definitely get accounts. They might have higher rights of being able to go into the office if they wanted to, speak to people, things like that. So that obviously that helps with the transparency of the organisation. I'm seeing a push definitely in a lot of deals that we do where investors are seeking that a company that doesn't by law need to be audited, they want those accounts to be audited. And so that's obviously another checks and balances there. You've got, a third-party auditor coming in and saying, yes, these accounts are correct. And then obviously what Fees spoke about was, you might have a founder who's sitting as a director on the board. There might be certain mechanisms that you put into the shareholders agreement in terms of, how do you deal with that person if you want to remove them? Or how do you, if they're the CEO, well, the CEO typically reports to the board. So then you've got to start thinking, okay, well, again, how can we remove the founder if we need to? So that's the mechanism typically in a startup that we use to kind of keep the founder accountable.
Yeah, that is probably the main, I'd say. You don't obviously have to have a shareholders agreement in place, but it is often kind of the source of corporate governance, or at least a good base document to look at, because it kind of splits out who makes decisions at what threshold, which ones are important and require unanimous versus which ones are just majority. So often you do see that the corporate governance structure sit within kind of the shareholders agreement.
And we have just one question here, I think from Vic on the Q&A. About constitution. So the question is, who is allowed to see your constitution, the public or just investors? Should you put it on your website? So this depends on whether or not you are a public or a private company. So private companies don't, basically you just only need to provide that to your shareholders and directors. And it'd be very rare that you would put that on your website. But public companies, as in listed companies, they definitely have to have their constitution on their website, and public companies also have to actually lodge their constitution with ASIC, so it is publicly available.
And I'd say, just as a general kind of comment of what the constitution is or kind of what purpose it serves, it's not, they're typically very vanilla documents. They don't usually have, incredibly kind of sensitive, commercially sensitive or anything information in them. And it's, and this is us being lawyers saying this, but I'm going to say it's kind of a document that I would say you kind of want to understand and actually try and look at as much as you can, because it does help you inform how your decisions are made. And so I wouldn't be, I guess, scared to kind of get on top of it, have it with you, and share it with kind of whoever, obviously the board and shareholders and whatnot. But it's not, I wouldn't say as big scary as the document that maybe it can kind of come across as.
Perfect.
Cool.
All right. Well, I think that's us done.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us. And if you've got any further questions, obviously feel free to email us. Our details are on our Mark Lawyers website. And then also subtitles on might be a resource that you might want to listen to. As Fee has explained, a lot of it is about just breaking down, I guess, a lot of these topics around startups. So we've got episodes on, shareholder agreements. We've even got episodes on incorporation, a lot about capital raising.
Yeah.
We just did one about ESOPs. So certainly there's more content out there if you want to listen.